Jedi Search, Chapter 7. The cracked and gasping wastelands of Kessel always made Morth Duel hungry. Staring out the landscape window, Duel's mechanical eye focused to the far distance. Kessel's surface was whitish and powdery, with a few hardy transplanted weeds trying to survive in the crevices. Great plumes from the atmosphere factories gushed into the pinkish sky in a losing battle against the weak gravity. Unseen radiation from the maw crackled against the atmospheric shields. The garrison moon, housing Kessel's defense fleet, was just setting on the horizon. Duel turned from the window and went to an alcove in the former warden's office. Time for a snack. He withdrew a cage of fat and juicy flying insects, pressing his face close to the mesh so he could see better with his dim eyesight. The insects had 10 legs, iridescent body cases, and succulent abdomens. They panicked the moment he moved the cage. Duel wrapped spongy fingers around the mesh, stirring them up. The insects flew around the confined space in a frenzy. Somehow, terror released a hormone that made their meat sweeter. He licked his swollen ribet lips. Opening the mesh door, Duel thrust his entire head into the cage. The insects fluttered around his eyes, his ears, his cheeks. Duel's sharp tongue shot out again and again, spearing the insects and slurping them into his mouth. He snapped up 3 more, then paused to swallow. Their squirming legs tickled the inside of his mouth. Giving a sigh of pleasure, Duel lapped up another pair. One insect flew directly into his open mouth, and Duel swallowed it whole. Someone knocked on his door and marched in before he could respond. Wearing the insect cage over his head, Duel turned around to see Skink Snacks, his gangly arms and legs jittering. "I have a report, Morith." Duel extricated his head from the insect cage, then sealed the opening. 3 bugs managed to escape and flew to the wide picture window, flinging themselves against the transparent steel. Duel decided to catch them later.
"Yes, what is it?"
"We have finished overhauling the Millennium Falcon. All identifying marks are removed, replaced with fake serial numbers. We made a few other modifications in addition to the regular repairs it needed. With your permission, I'll have it flown up to the garrison moon, where it can be incorporated into our space navy. Light freighters aren't the best warships, but with a good pilot, they can still cause plenty of damage. And the Falcon is closer to a fighter than a freighter." Duel nodded.
Good. What about our work on the energy shield generators? I want them functional as soon as possible, just in case the New Republic comes after us.
"Our engineers on the moon base think they can reroute the circuits, so we won't need all the parts we're missing. Kessel will be impregnable before long." Duel's single eye lit up with eagerness.
Have Han Solo and his Wookiee gone into the mines yet?
Skink Snacks tapped his fingertips together. "I've reserved an armored personnel transport and will make the delivery personally within the hour." He fingered his double blaster. "If they try anything, I want to be the one to deal with it." Duel smiled.
"I look forward to them rotting in the dark."
He waved his splayed hands.
"Well, what are you waiting for?"
Moving with his jerky walk, Skink Snacks left the warden's chambers. Duel smiled at the thought of his revenge on Han Solo, but uneasiness tugged at him. The New Republic seemed far away and insignificant, but from his scan of Han's mind, he knew the magnitude of firepower that could be directed against him. Not since Duel had taken over the prison facilities from Kessel's upstart slave lords had he felt such impending doom. Under the old system, it had been so much simpler. By blackmailing or paying off prison guards, Duel had managed to set himself up as a kingpin of spice smuggling right under the Empire's nose. He sold maps and access codes for Kessel's energy shield, fostering small-time spice operations on other parts of the planet. Hapless entrepreneurs would work their new mines, then sell the product in secret to Duel. Once the spice veins began to play out, Duel, acting as a loyal prison official, would discover the illicit operation and report it to his Imperial contact. When Imperial troops raided those illegal mines, Duel's handpicked guards made certain that anyone who could point a finger at Duel never survived capture. The other helpless lackeys would be put to work in the primary mines. It was a win-win situation for Duel. During the prison revolt, Duel targeted his primary rivals and made the toughest guards go after the worst smugglers until they slaughtered each other. This left Morith Duel in charge, with Skinksnacks as his right-hand man. Duel had captured the warden, sending him to work in the spice mines until he was broken. Then, for the entertainment value, Duel had planted spice grubs in his body. As the grubs chewed up his insides, the warden had gone through marvelously theatrical convulsions, in the middle of which Duel encased him in carbonite, using freezing equipment that had once been used to prepare violent and dangerous prisoners for transport. Reminiscing always aroused him. Reaching into a drawer of his desk, Duel withdrew the bright yellow cravat that signified his readiness to mate. He secured it in place, then drew in a long hissing breath as he refocused his mechanical eye and glanced at his reflection. Irresistible. Duel rubbed his palms along his ribs to straighten his lizard skin waistcoat, then strutted out of his office down the corridor. He entered the secure wing, keying in the access code that only he knew. Then he sucked in a deep breath. Flicking his tongue in and out, he could pick up the pheromones from the air. Inside their cubicle cells, the captive Rybet females huddled in the corners, trying to hide in the shadows. Duel's yellow cravat seemed very bright in the dimness. Alone on Kessel, Morith Duel had been frustrated for many years. But now that he ran the planet, he could afford to have dozens of female slaves shipped from his homeworld. Sometimes the females did not cooperate, but after years of working in the correctional facility, Duel had plenty of experience in dealing with unruly prisoners. Lately, his only difficulty had been in choosing among the females. As he sauntered down the narrow corridor, setting his mechanical eye to high focus and peering into the cells, Morith Duel's writhing lips formed a huge, lustful smile. Kessel's landscape rushed beneath the armored prisoner transport. Han Solo could see only a narrow strip through the window slits in the prisoner's compartment. He and Chewie had been strapped into their seats and linked to resistance feedback electrodes that would knock them unconscious if they struggled too much. Chewbacca had even more trouble with the full body restraint than he had with the stun cuffs. Skinksnacks hunched over the pilot controls, circling the transport away from the battlements of the Imperial Correction Facility. An armored guard sat in the co-pilot's seat, directing his blaster rifle towards Han and Chewie.
Hey, how about pointing out some of the landmarks, Skinksnacks? Han said. What kind of tour is this anyway?
Shut up, Solo, Skinksnacks said.
Why should I? I bought a full-price ticket.
Skinksnacks sent a painful jolt through the restraining electrodes. Chewbacca roared, and Han muttered,
Oh, there goes your tip, Skinksnacks.
The Scarecrow guided the transport around a huge open pit that plunged deep into the ground. Rusted girders and support structures stood like skeletal fingers propped up in the whitish barrens. It took Han a moment to realize this was a shaft bored into the crust by the giant atmosphere factories, chewing through the rocks and dissolving out oxygen and carbon dioxide to replenish the constantly fading air. After the huge factory had sucked out the viable breathing gases, it had left access to an entire network of underground tunnels for spice mining. Skinksnacks set the prisoner transport down on the rocky ground and fitted a breath mask over his nose and mouth. He gave another mask to the guard.
Well, what about us?
Han said. You won't be out very long, Skinksnacks said. A little lightheadedness will do you good. Punching a button on the control panel, Skinksnacks released their restraints. Han stretched his sore arms. Instantly, the guard snapped up his rifle, and Skinksnacks whipped out his modified double blaster, both pointing the deadly barrels directly at Han. Han froze.
Just stretch it. It's okay, calm down.
When Skinksnacks opened the side door to the transport vehicle, Han felt his ears pop. Moist air flashed into white vapor, wafting in the rarefied atmosphere next to the open pit. Han felt the oxygen being stolen from his lungs. Instinctively, he drew in a deep breath, but that helped little. He and Chewbacca stumbled out of the craft as Skinksnacks and the guard prodded them. At the rim of the crater, they found an elevator cage on tracks that plunged deep into the pit. Skinksnacks seemed to be moving with deliberate slowness. Unable to breathe, Han tried to hurry, stumbling into the elevator cage and gesturing Chewbacca after him. He gasped and wheezed. Black spots began to appear in front of his eyes. When he did manage to breathe, an entire lungful of the thin air, the cold of Kessel bit into his chest. A few years ago, we had the atmosphere factories running full tilt, Skinksnacks said, his words muffled behind the face mask. Duel figured it was a frivolous waste of energy. The guard shut the wire mesh door, and Skinksnacks operated the elevator controls. The cage descended at a rapid clip until the window of sky shrank to a small spot of blue light high above. They saw openings into the rock wall sealed off with steel doors. At each level, a ring of light encircled the pit, but many of the illuminators had either burned out or been broken. Chewbacca hung onto the bars of the elevator with his long, hairy arms, panting for air. His pink tongue protruded, turning purplish from lack of oxygen. Han, shivering and dizzy and starved for breath, slumped to the bottom of the elevator. When the elevator abruptly stopped, the jolt slammed Han's head into the mesh. As he looked down through the open cage floor, he saw the pit continuing immeasurably far below them. Get up, Skinksnacks said, kicking him. No time to sleep. Come on, you'll get a breath of fresh air inside. With some help from Skinksnacks, Han managed to haul himself to his feet. The smaller guard had much more difficulty manhandling Chewbacca forward. Opening the gate of the elevator, they had access to one of the sealed metal doors. Skinksnacks cranked the hatch, and all four of them staggered into the small tiled chamber. Han could barely see anymore. His ears buzzed. His eyesight was a mixture of black specks, roaring blood, and dim shadows of the objects around him. But as soon as Skinksnacks sealed the door, glorious oxygen flooded the chamber. Before the captives could recover, the guard shoved the barrel of his blaster rifle under Chewbacca's chin, and Skinksnacks held his own weapon against Han's head. Almost there, Skinksnacks said. No funny stuff now. Han, happy just to be breathing again, couldn't dream of doing anything. At least not yet. On the other side of the airlock was a large muster room filled with lethargic-looking workers ready to begin their shift in the spice mines. The muster room had been blasted out of solid rock, and a tall bank of bunks ran along one side of the room. An empty eating section with long tables took up the central area. Cameras stared down at the activity from perches on the walls. Guards in hodgepodge stormtrooper uniforms waited behind screens in the control rooms. Other guards kept an eye on the people moving about in the muster area. All the workers looked pale and haggard, as if they had been underground and underfed for years. A burly man strode up to meet them, keeping his eyes fixed on Skinksnacks. The man had a lumpy face, a lumpy chin covered with bristly black stubble, and lumpy arms as if his massive muscles had all been attached at the wrong places.
You brought me 2 more, the man said. Only 2, that's not enough.
He reached out and grabbed Chewbacca's hairy arm. Chewbacca roared and flinched away, but the lumpy man didn't notice.
Well, the Wookiee's worth 3 men, but I don't know about the other one. This doesn't take care of half the people I've lost.
Skinksnacks glowered at him. So stop losing people, he said with a voice of ice, then nudged Han. This is Boss Roke. He's in charge of breaking you. He gets extra points with Morath Duel to make your life miserable.
He doesn't seem to be doing a very good job keeping track of his workers, Han said.
Roke flashed him a withering glare.
Something's taken my men down in the deep tunnels. I've had 2 more missing since yesterday. They vanished without a trace. No locators, nothing.
Han shrugged.
It's hard to get good help these days.
Skinksnacks pulled out his double blaster and shoved it in Han's face again, but he spoke to Boss Roke. Get thermal suits for these 2. We'll watch them while they get into uniform. Roke snapped his fingers and 2 guards went rummaging through some cubicles.
The human won't be difficult, but the Wookiee, We don't carry much in that size.
In the end, the guard found a large, misshapen suit that had once been worn by some alien creature that had 3 arms. But it fit Chewbacca well enough after they sealed off the 3rd arm. The empty sleeve and glove dangled down his chest. A heater packed between the shoulder blades powered the whole thing to keep them warm down in the frigid mine tunnels. Han was relieved to see a small breath mass attached to the suit. Skinksnack's back towards the elevator. The guard had already entered the airlock chamber. One last time, as if he felt he hadn't used enough tiresome threats for one afternoon, Skinksnacks pointed the double blaster at Han. Next time, maybe Morath will let me use this.
If you clean up your room without being told and you eat all your vegetables, Han taunted, then he might let you have a special treat.
Shift Alpha, ready for work detail.
Boss Roke bellowed into the muster room, and dozens of weary people shuffled to squares painted on the floor. Roke pointed to 2 empty squares.
You two, positions 18 and 19, now.
What? No new employee orientation?
Han asked. With a sadistic grin on his face, Boss Roke shoved him towards the squares.
It's on-the-job training.
At some unspoken signal, the workers mounted breath masks on their faces. Seeing this, Han and Chewbacca followed suit. A big metal door on the far side of the wall slid open to reveal an illuminated chamber 100 meters long, in which floated a centipede-like mine transport of little cars linked together by magnetic attractors. A high-pitched tone pinged through hidden speakers, and the workers took their seats on one of the floating mine cars. As people climbed aboard, the separate sections of the cars swayed back and forth. Chewbacca grunted a question. Han looked around, blinking.
I don't know any more about this than you do, buddy.
Now that Skinksnacks had departed, he no longer needed to continue his blustering. Fear started to trickle into his limbs. Boss Roke took a seat in the pilot car. Other guards were stationed evenly throughout the open tram. All the guards wore infrared goggles. Every one of the prisoners sat motionless. Behind them, the metal door slammed shut. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. Now what? Han mumbled to himself. All the lights went out. Han and Chewbacca plunged into an absolute suffocating blackness like a blanket of tar.
What the?
Han drew a sudden deep breath. The blackness was palpable. He couldn't see a thing. Beside him, Chewbacca groaned in alarm. He heard the other workers moving, shuffling. Han's ears strained as his imagination tried to understand what was going on. He heard a clunking, sliding sound.
Hold on, Chewie,
he said. A metal door at the opposite side of the chamber opened up. The sound of its movement along rough metal tracks echoed in the enclosed space. Wind rushed around their ears as the air spilled outward into the mine tunnels of Kessel. In a sudden panic, Han pushed his breath mask tighter against his face, just as he felt the atmosphere grow thin. The fleeing air took with it whatever heat had remained, making his exposed skin tingle with cold. The mine cars lurched on their repulsor lifts, picking up speed. Acceleration slammed Han into his hard, uncomfortable seat. He could hear the air roaring past his head, feel the tunnel walls around him. The transport whipped around a curve, and Han grabbed the cold metal railing to keep himself from flying out of his seat. The mine cars whisked along, tilting downward then lurching sideways. He had no idea how Boss Roke could possibly see where he was going unless the whole system was computer-controlled. Behind them, just after they had passed under an echoing archway, a heavy metal door slammed shut with the sound like an avalanche of scrap metal. Han couldn't understand why the spice miners didn't string up at least some cheap illuminators as guideposts along the tunnels. But then it came to him like a slap in the face. The realization that since glitterstim spice was photoactive, made potent in the presence of light, it obviously had to be mined in total darkness or else it would be ruined. Total darkness. Han and Chewbacca would spend their days at hard labor in the mines without ever being able to see each other, or where they were, or what they were doing. Han had to blink his eyes just to make sure they were open instead of closed. Not that it made any difference. A shiver went down his back. Boss Roke had said that some unknown thing deep in the mines was preying on helpless workers, snatching them unawares. How could anybody run from a carnivorous attacker while surrounded by complete darkness? The quality of the sound changed off and on. As Han's mind grew accustomed to processing information through his ears, it became obvious whenever the rushing minecar passed side tunnels because of the sudden hole in the wind. Breathing through the mask, he could smell nothing other than flat, recycled air. The minecar wobbled from side to side, rocking as somebody moved about in the seats, climbing over the individual cars. The person slowly clambered over one seat back, then another, approaching their position. Han thought he heard someone breathing, straining, growing nearer.
You there, number 14, sit down, a guard shouted.
Number 14, Han thought. How could the guard possibly see which one had been moving about? Then he remembered the infrared goggles. The guards could probably see everyone, bright silhouettes against the backdrop of blackness. The car stopped jostling for a few moments, but then the rocking started again. The mysterious person kept moving toward them. Somebody heaved himself over the seat to the empty spot right behind Han and Chewbacca.
Hey, I told you to sit down,
the guard shouted. This is my new seat, a voice said.
That's your new seat,
the guard said, strangely repeating the words before he fell silent. Han forced himself not to speak. Since he couldn't see anything himself, the intruder must be just shifting about, unable to tell where he was going. Or could he have his own set of infrared goggles? Had Skinksnacks or Morith Duel hired some assassin to get rid of Han and Chewbacca while no one was watching? A quick slash from a vibrator knife? A shove that knocked him off the floating transport, abandoning him down in the empty labyrinth of tunnels? In the darkness, Han would never be able to find his way back. He wondered if he would starve, freeze, or suffocate first. He didn't want to find out. He heard the faint, echoing breath of someone speaking behind a breath mask, leaning closer. Beside him, Chewbacca bristled in anticipation.
Are you really from the outside? The voice said. I haven't been above ground for years.
It seemed hopeful, soft and tenor, but muffled behind the breath mask and the rushing wind. Han couldn't tell if it was the voice of an aged man, a deep-voiced woman, or a quiet, meek clerk from the Imperial prison. Han's mind pictured a skeletal old man with long, scraggly hair, tattered beard, and ragged clothes.
Yeah, or from out there. A lot of things have changed.
I'm Kip Duran. After a moment's hesitation, Han introduced himself and Chewbacca. Suspecting some kind of trap, he decided not to give too much information. Kip Duran seemed to sense this and talked about himself without asking too many prying questions. You'll get to know everybody here. That's just the way of it. I've lived most of my life on Kessel. My parents were political prisoners, exiled on this planet when the Emperor started cracking down on civil unrest. My brother Zeth was taken off to the Imperial Military Training Center on Kurita, and we never heard another word from him. I got stuck here in the spice mines. I always thought they'd come back and haul me to Kurita too, but I guess they forgot. Han tried to imagine Kip's life going from bad to worse.
How come you're still down in the mines?
During the prison revolt, they didn't much care who ended up here. Now most of the workers are the old Imperial prison guards. Nobody thought to let me out when they changed everything up top. I've never been important enough. Kip made a sound that must have been a bitter laugh. People say I have good luck in all sorts of things, but my luck has never been good enough to let me have a normal life. He paused as if gathering hope. In that moment, Han wished he could see the stranger's face. Is it really true the Empire has fallen?
7 years ago, Kip, Han said. The Emperor was blown up with his Death Star. We've been fighting battles ever since, but the New Republic is trying to keep everything together. Chewie and I came here as ambassadors to reestablish contact with Kessel. He paused. Obviously, the people of Kessel weren't interested.
Han snapped his attention to the front as he heard something happen to the cars ahead. The front car split off. He could hear it echo with a diminishing swoosh down one of the side tunnels. A few moments later, another two cars separated themselves and went down another side tunnel, as their sounds diminished in the hollow distance. The rest of the floating mine car continued down the main tunnel. They're separating the mining teams, Kip said. I wanted to be with you. Tell me everything.
Kip, Han said with a sigh, it looks like we'll have plenty of time to give you the details.
The audio hum of the mine car's repulsor lifts deepened. Han felt the breeze on his face dwindle as they slowed. His hands and face were numb. His ears tingled with the cold, but the rest of his body seemed comfortably warm in the heated thermal suit. The guard who had shouted at Kip spoke when the floating cars stopped.
Everybody out! Link up! March to the work area!
The remaining cars swayed as the prisoners climbed off and stood in silence on the crumpled ground. Their equipment grated against each other in the darkness, and their boots scuffed the dirt. A pandemonium of little sounds echoed in the claustrophobic tunnel, making the blackness press in even more heavily.
Where are we going? Han said.
Kip grabbed a loop on Han's belt. Just hold the person in front of you. Believe me, you don't want to get lost down here.
I believe you,
Han said. Chewbacca made his own noise of agreement. When the work detail had lined up, the front guard began to march them along. Han took small shuffling steps to keep from stumbling over rubble on the floor, but he still tripped into Chewbacca several times. They turned to pass through another tunnel entrance. Han heard a faint thump and a yowl of pain from the Wookiee.
Watch your head there, buddy,
he said. He heard a rustle of fur inside a thermal suit as Chewbacca bent down to pass through the arch.
Here's the rail, the guard said. Stop here, take your time, and go down. What's a rail? Han asked.
Once you touch it, you'll figure it out, Kip answered. The noises he heard made no sense to Han. He couldn't determine what was actually happening. He discerned sliding sounds of fabric, bitten back outcries of surprise or fear. When Chewbacca shuffled up, he voiced a guttural complaint, shaking his entire body in refusal. The guard lashed out with something hard that struck Chewbacca. The Wookiee roared in pain and swung his arm trying to hit the guard, but apparently smacked only the rock wall instead. Chewbacca grew more upset, flailing right and left. Han had to duck to keep from being battered.
Chewie, calm down, stop it!
The Wookiee slowly regained control of himself at the sound of Han's voice.
Do what I tell you,
the guard shouted. It's okay, Kip added his own encouragement. We do this every day.
I'll go first, Chewie,
Han said.
Whatever it is. Down there,
the guard snapped. Han bent over, fumbled with his hands, and felt a big hole in the floor like a trapdoor to lower tunnels, with piled rubble all around it. His fingers found a cold metal railing about the size of a typical steel girder, polished smooth and plunging downwards like a slide or a metal banister.
You want me to ride that?
Han asked.
Where does it go?
Don't worry, Kip said. It's the best way down.
You've got to be kidding.
Then he heard Chewbacca laughing, a nasal chuffing sound. That made up Han's mind for him. He sat down on the metal rail and wrapped his legs around it, placing his hands behind his hips and gripping the rail as best he could. The slippery fabric of the thermal suit immediately started him sliding. The darkness grabbed at him as he picked up speed. Han imagined sharp stalactites just centimeters above his head, waiting to take the top off his skull if he sat up at the wrong moment. He continued to accelerate.
I don't like this, he said.
Suddenly the rail disappeared beneath him, and he tumbled down onto a mound of powdery sand. Another two workers scrambled forward to yank him clear of the end of the rail. He brushed dust off his thermal suit, though he couldn't see the dirt anyway. A few moments later, Chewbacca came down with a long, echoing howl, and shortly after that came Kip Duran and the guard.
Line up again,
the guard said. Chewbacca grunted and huffed a few words. Han snorted.
Don't tell me it was fun.
The guard marched them ahead. When the ground dropped out from under them, they splashed into a shallow lake. The pressure of the water pushed against the legs of Han's suit. The captive miners sloshed ahead, holding onto each other in their blindness. The water had a sour, brackish smell, and Han's stomach clenched, anticipating a drop-off that would plunge him in over his head. Chewbacca whined, but kept his comments to himself. Under the water, something soft and finger-like poked against Han's legs. Other contacts nudged at his feet, prodding and coiling around his calves.
Hey!
He thrashed about with his feet. The ghostly, touching things swarmed about him. Han pictured soft, blind grubs, hungry in the darkness. Their mouths would be filled with fangs, waiting for something to eat, something helpless in the dark, as he was. He splashed again to drive them away. "Don't call attention to yourself," Kip Duran said in a low voice. "That will only bring more of them." Han forced himself not to overreact, to walk with gliding, even strides. None of the other prisoners cried out. Apparently, no one had been eaten alive yet, though the small probing fingers or suckers or mouths continued to play around his legs. His throat felt very dry. He wanted to drop to his knees when they finally reached the tunnel on the other side of the subterranean lake. Behind them, dripping water and tiny splashing sounds echoed in the grotto. An unknown time later, they arrived at the actual spice mining area. The guard withdrew an apparatus from his pack, making shuffling and clinking noises as he did so. Unseen, he set it up along the walls of the tunnel. "We have to go deep to get the good spice deposits," Kip said. "Down here, the glitter stem is fresh and fibrous, instead of old and powdery like the higher mines. The spice veins are laid in crisscross patterns along the walls of the tunnel, never going much below the surface of the rock." Before Han could say anything else, a high-pitched, teeth-jarring hum pounded against the tunnel. Chewbacca roared in pain. Then a skin of rock along the inner tunnel sloughed off. The guard had used an acoustic disruptor that penetrated only a few inches into the rock, crumbling it down. "Get to it," he said. Kneeling on the rubble-strewn floor, Kip showed Han and Chewbacca how to sort through the crushed rock, feeling with cold, numbed fingers through the broken pebbles and debris to pluck out strands of glitter stem, like tufts of hair or asbestos fiber. Han's hands felt raw from the work and the biting cold, but none of the other prisoners complained. They all seemed beaten. He could hear them breathing and gasping as they continued to exert themselves. Han stuffed fragments of glitter stem into the gathering pouch at his hip. He felt a sinking feeling, like a knife twisting inside him. He could be at this job for a long, long time. After the team finished shifting through the rubble, the guard moved them further down the tunnel, then activated the acoustic disruptor to bring down another section of the wall. As they huddled in the tunnel, picking at broken rock, Han could think only of his aching knees, his burning fingers, of how nice it would be to be back with Leia again. No one had told him how long a shift was, not that he had any way of telling time in the darkness. He grew hungry. He grew thirsty. He kept working. During a lull, Han felt a tingle go up his spine. He looked, knowing he could see nothing in the dark, but his ears, now attuned as his primary sense, picked up a distant rustling, 1,000 whispering voices growing louder, picking up speed like a hydro locomotive bulleting down a tube. A pearly glow seemed to seep out of the air. "What?" "Shh," Kip answered. The prisoners had stopped working. A faint glittering dazzle, like a dense cloud of faint fireflies, shot through the tunnel, humming and chittering. Han ducked. Around him he heard the others also falling flat on the debris-covered floor. The glowing thing shot down the hollow tube, rolling and roiling. Once it passed them and went beyond the point where they had mined spice from the walls, the glowing thing suddenly curved right and plunged straight into the solid rock, vanishing like a fish falling back into a dark pool. Behind them, along the curved lengths of the tunnel, tiny blue sparks flickered from the exposed spice that had been activated by the light source whizzing past. The blue sparks sputtered and flickered, and quickly faded. Han's eyes ached from the sudden barrage of light, a light that was probably too dim for him to have seen under normal circumstances, but his eyes had been yearning in the blackness for hours now. "What was that?" he shouted. He heard Kip panting beside him. "Nobody knows. It's about the 15th one I've seen over the years. We call them bogies. Never hurt anybody, or so we think, but nobody knows what's grabbing those people down in the deep mines." The guard himself seemed shaken, and Han could hear a quaver in his voice. "That's enough. End the shift. Let's make our way back to the cars." That sounded like a good idea to Han. When the string of mine cars returned to the long, holding grotto and the metal door closed behind them, Han heard the sound of weapons being drawn. All workers were ordered to strip out of their thermal suits. Han could understand the precautions. With a brief mental boost from stolen glitter stem, a prisoner might be able to stage an escape. Although Han had been to the barren surface of Kessel and wondered where an escapee might go. When the standard lights finally came back on, the blinding glare was enough to make Han crouch over, as if someone had punched him in the gut. He shielded his eyes. He felt a hand take him and lead him into a muster room. "It's okay, Han. Just follow me. Let your eyes get used to it. There's no hurry." But Han was in a hurry to see what Kip Duran looked like. He kept blinking away tears and forcing his pupils to contract enough that he could make sense out of the brilliant images showering around him. But when he finally discerned Kip's form, he blinked again, this time in surprise.
You're just a kid.
Han saw a dark, tousle-headed teen who looked as if he cropped his own hair with a blunt object. He had wide eyes surrounded by dark rims, and his skin was pale from years of living in the darkness of the spice mines. Kip was wiry and tough-looking. He stared at Han with hope and a little intimidation. "Don't worry," Kip said. "I do the best I can." Kip reminded him of the brash and wide-eyed young Luke Skywalker Han had first met in the Mos Eisley Cantina. But Kip seemed tougher than Luke had been, not quite so naive. With the rough life Kip had, growing up on Kessel and locked in the spice mines without anyone to watch over him, it was no wonder the kid had a hard streak in him. At that moment, Han couldn't decide which he hated more. The Empire, for inflicting such hardships on Kip and his family, or Morith Dul for perpetuating them, or himself for getting Chewie and him into this mess in the first place.